Can you tell me something about the project that you undertook?
So the project was part of my PhD research, so it was looking at 3 factory occupations that took place in Scotland between February 1981 and March 1982. And the thing that was interesting about them was they were all in workplaces with predominantly female workforces. So it was the Lee Jeans factory in Greenock, the Lovable Bra factory in Cumbernauld, and the Plessy Capacitors factory in Bathgate. Now, what was fascinating about it was 3 workplaces that the reason for closure was the same across all of them. It was capital relocation. It was moving factory and machinery to lower production manufacturing sites to essentially save money. So this is the kind of big wave of global capital migration through the kind of accelerated period of deindustrialisation in the early 1980s. So what fascinated me about the 3 workplaces was the fact that it was such a militant response. You know, it wasn't just opposing closure and relocation. It was actually seizing the means of production, to use the kind of classic phrase, barricading the bosses out, barricading the workers in to hold on to the factory and the stock that was remaining to kind of maintain leverage over the employer. And the other thing is as PhD students, we're always looking for something that's not been done before, aren't we? That's how we get funding for projects. This is new, this is different. And it really struck me as odd that there hadn't been much research done on these factory occupations individually, but no one had looked at them as a kind of collective experience. I've been arguing, which I've been pulled up by a couple of reviewers and various things that I've submitted, but I've managed to kind of convince them that it is one of the most fascinating periods of Scottish labour history. Because you've got massive closures at the time. You've got the car plant in Linwood closes, Singer sewing machine factory closes. And the last thing that's interesting about these 3 disputes is they were, to varying degrees, successful. If you judge success on what were the aims of occupation, the aim was preventing the full-scale closure of the workplaces. In each instance, that was successful. To different degrees, Plessy was probably the least successful because I think 90 jobs out of 350 were secured at the end of it. But even that, the company's aim of just complete shutdown and completely moving production was not achieved because of the actions that the workers took. So that was a kind of rationale for the project. And in terms of kind of theoretical frameworks, I looked at it through the prism of mobilisation theory, so thinking about how workers mobilise themselves, what factors kind of play into that in launching industrial action, and also through the lens of deindustrialisation studies, which is something I've been really kind of focused on in the last 5 or so years of my research, really thinking about, how do people remember these seismic events? What do they think about in terms of their own actions, and what do they think about in terms of the outcome? So looking at it from 30 years after the event, how do they position that within their life history? And also what became interesting for the interviews was how do they position that in the history of their town? What is the significance of this for their local community and the history of their local communities? Because, as I say, it's not something that's talked about much. It's not something that's extensively publicised. So it kind of gave an opportunity for those that were involved to basically say in their own words why they think this was important and why people should know about it. So that's the kind of overview of the project.
How did you choose who to interview?
It was completely just whoever would speak to me. With the pressures of time that a PhD project has, it was very much advertising. Were you involved in this? Did you work in this factory? Would you like to speak to me? Which was mostly successful. I'll come on to the interview excerpt that I'm talking about because that was slightly different. But certainly it had its difficulties, and I remember one freezing cold November day standing outside Tesco's in Cumbernauld handing out leaflets to anyone who looked 50 years or older, just basically saying, did you used to work in the knicker factory that was in Cumbernauld? Because there was no infrastructure in Cumbernauld which I could kind of tie in with. There was no local labour club. There was an old workers club that was tied into an engineering factory, but apart from that there wasn't very much. And one of the things that I also used, which kind of almost pretty much saved the project, because I was really struggling at this point, was reminiscence groups on Facebook. So you see these things pop up all over the time. I'm I've used them in Newcastle, like old pictures of Newcastle, heating history and things like that. So I got in touch with, I think it was Cumbernauld, Old and New, the group was called, and spoke with the admin of the page, and he put up an advert. And what was good about that was it wasn't just people would email me or message me directly, but you could follow the conversation strands through the post. So I did just kind of cold message people who would say, oh, somebody would tag in, oh, Mum, you worked here and you remember this, and I would just message them and say, look, I'm the person who's doing this project that you can engage with. Do you want to take part in an interview? The one for Legions, it was easier because that took place in Greenock, which is where I'm from, and I knew people who'd been involved. Helen Monaghan, whose interview I've kind of selected here, she is my dad's cousin's wife. So it was easy to get in touch with Helen because I knew her. I would bump into her on the street. You could talk away to her, but even just my mum was the same age as a lot of them. So, Mum, do you know when did it finish school and went and worked in Legions? Oh, such and such. And it was just that, it's that insider status you've got in it. So, I remember one woman interviewed Sadie. She worked in the jewellers in the town centre. So I just walked in and went, oh, Sadie, I'm Anne Mars' boy. Did you used to work in the Legions factory? And a couple of weeks later, we're sitting doing an interview about it. So that was much easier than the other ones. And Plessy was tricky because that factory had been there much longer, and the other two that had a longer history. That opened up just after the Second World War. So by the time that occupation took place in 1982, most of the workers there were 40s and 50s. So by the time I got into doing interviews, a lot of them had obviously died. So there was a much smaller cohort for Plessy than there was for the other two.
I get the impression that you really got rank and file rather than, say, conveners or shop stewards, or is that the case? Or, what I'm trying to get at here is, what would you have considered to be an activist in that dispute? Or did that matter?
So it was mostly rank and file. The shop stewards at both Lovable and Plessy had died by the time I started the project. So I interviewed two leaders, if you like. They were both at Legions. So it was Helen Monaghan, she was a shop steward in the factory, and Bridie Bellingham. Bridie actually died a few months ago. I read her obituary in the paper. But mostly it was the rank and file activists, if you like. And that was more what I was looking for in terms of the project. I wanted to understand how, because especially in the press reports that were released, it was young lasses that were taking part in this. And it was women who were 16, 17, 18, whatever. So it was those voices that I was kind of most interested in. I interviewed two trade union officials who, shock horror, 1980s, were both blokes. But they were both fantastic interviewees. If I can remember the name, Jim Swan was the convener at the British Motor Corporation in Bathgate, so he was kind of involved as a supporter in the Plessy dispute. And then John Easdale was the rep for the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, and he was involved more with the Lovable dispute than with the Legions one. So those are the two kind of official narratives that I kind of collect. And it's one of those funny anecdotes that when I was interviewing John Easdale, I interviewed him in the GMB offices in Kilmarnock, and that was the day that Jeremy Corbyn was approved to stand for the Labour leadership. So that was a kind of buzz that was around the office. Now Corbyn's standing, he's been selected. And the person that actually came into the meeting and told us about it was Richard Leonard, who is now the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. So it's just one of those, when you think, doing a history interview around trade unionism and the Labour movement, and these two kind of, Richard Leonard, who kind of took over the Scottish Labour Party, and then on that day that Corbyn takes over, is approved to take over the British Labour Party. It's funny how history interviews kind of coincide with other big historical events.
Did the women you interviewed, did they have a sense of change through the dispute? Did they feel as if they'd changed through the dispute, or did they talk about that, or is that too difficult to do in terms of oral history?
Well, most of them, no. Most of them, it was a case of, we did this, and it was a very specific response to a very specific situation that we were faced with. One interviewee, Kathy Robertson, she was brilliant. She was telling me about how her father was chasing her down the close because she came home with copies of the Socialist Worker because she'd shacked up with a guy who was in the SWP and she wanted to impress him. She was selling the paper and stuff like that. So she actually, I think she was the only interviewee that talked about a kind of radicalisation of herself through the dispute. She was saying, I was going on the marches, I was staying with socialists around Britain. And the other one was Maggie Wallace, who ended up being one of the kind of spokespeople for the dispute. She was very young at the time. She was about 17 or 18. And if you meet her now, if you listen to the interview, Maggie's just nuts. No, she's brilliant. She's fantastic. I knew Maggie a wee bit because she used to work in the corner shop near my house. And she's just one of these, you can picture her standing in front of a big crowd, just really going for it. And what she spoke about was really interesting because she said, if we were sat in a factory in the middle of an industrial estate and nobody was really paying attention, you would wonder, what are we really doing this for? But she got a real sense of the purposelessness of what she was doing through going and speaking. She spoke at the SNP convention, she spoke at miners' clubs, and she really spoke about the buzz you got, getting a standing ovation for all these people, and it really made you feel that what you were doing was worthwhile. But it was one of the silences, if you like, in the interview that they never really spoke about, because you would expect in some ways to take part in such a militant operation that afterwards that would kind of shape you. You would go on and do other things. You would be an activist for life, if you like, but that didn't materialise, and there's currently writing the book up from the project. There's kind of reasons I'm trying to kind of formulate in my head as to why that was the case, and I think the main one that I've worked out, or that I'm kind of putting forward, is it was the gender of the people involved. If you are a Jimmy Reid or a Scargill, or a leader of a kind of big male dispute, you afterwards, your opinion is sought. I mean, you're asked to kind of contribute to the news. If you're Jimmy Reid, you get elected rector at Glasgow University, because that is accepted as something that a male activist will do. And there is writings in the kind of sociology literature from the 70s and 80s that women were permitted to be activists for a period of time, but once the specific case or dispute they were involved with was concluded, there was an expectation that they would go back to being ordinary workers and carrying on with their life as normal. And there was also household pressures on that as well. So in the clip that I've selected for this, Helen talks about after the dispute, she didn't have time. She didn't have time to be something in terms of a labour leader or whatever. She just wanted to, she had done her job as far as she's seen it. She protected the job, she saved the factory, and she talks quite a lot about, I had a man at home, I had 3 wains in the house, I wasn't going to go and be, an MP, an MS or whatever. I had done my job and I was quite happy with it. I think the gender dynamics of that are really fascinating.
That's really interesting, because popular representations of women's industrial action often suggests that they become much more gender aware or much more feminist in their outlook, but you're actually finding that didn't happen.
No, and Helen Monaghan has been quite clear that it was not a feminist movement she was part of. It was not a women's rights movement. It was a class movement. It was workers against capital. It wasn't women against men. And I think, so I took part in recording for a TV programme that's looking at Legions last month, and Helen was part of that. So they interviewed me as a kind of historian, interviewed Helen for the perspective that she had. And I kind of sat back and listened to Helen's interview, and I get a real sense that she's pushing back against this idea of it was the girls against the boys, it was the women against the men, because something she stressed it in my interview, but she really wanted to get it across to the TV crew that were interviewing her, was they could not have done it if it was not for the men of Greenock in the shipyards and various workplaces supporting what they were doing, through coming to the factory with financial donations, coming to the factory for just kind of physical support. And I think that's really interesting. She's really pushing back against this. No, it was a women's movement type thing. And she said, no, this was Greenock against Legions. This was everyone in working class Inverclyde that was on their side. It wasn't just women against men. And there's an anecdote that I keep meaning to ask her about, because I've heard it through other people, never from her. And it was after I'd done the interview. So the anecdote, as far as I know, and obviously this is not verified because I've not actually asked Helen about it, but it came from someone that was there, was the Glasgow University Feminist Society visited the factory to offer support and solidarity. And they were sitting having a cup of tea, blathering away, and Helen looked at her watch and went, Christ, I'm sorry, I really need to go. I've got to get home because my man's finishing work and I need to get the tea made. And apparently the kind of middle-class Glasgow University Feminist Society were horrified that this, as a leader of their occupation, had to get down the road to get the tea made and then get back to the factory. But that, for Helen, and certainly what she has told me about the dispute, was life went on outside the factory. She had to still do She still had the double burden of housework and militant labour, although she always stresses that, you know, her man, as she always calls him, was very supportive, done what he could, but there were still certain things that she had to do as a housewife and a mother that kind of superseded the occupation, if you like.
Now that you're writing up, is there some advice you'd have given your younger self in terms of collecting the oral histories?
Do life histories. So the interviews that I did were very short, sharp and focused. Not overly, because I had to get a sense of who these people were before the dispute, but it was much more thematic than what I would do now. It was like, what was school like? What did your parents do? Where were you brought up? Get to the factory. And I really probed for the mundane aspects of work. Now, how did you make a pair of jeans, for example, or how did you make a bra? And I had a fantastic experience with one of the women that I interviewed from the bra factory, who actually just went into a drawer, pulled one out and kind of spoke through the entire garment and saying, right, this is how the straps go on, the clips, this is how you put in the cups, etc., etc. But the interviews were mostly about an hour and a half, and thinking back on it, it was a real missed opportunity to think much more deeply about these people. But again, that is the pressures of time that you have when you're doing a PhD. You know, when you've got a job. So the interviews I've been doing recently, I'll go back and interview people 2, 3 or 4 times because I've got the time to do that. I can afford to do that. Whereas with the PhD, it was much more, right, I have to interview a certain number of people. This person has been interviewed, this box is now ticked, move on, analyse the stuff. So I think that would be the main one. The other, I'm trying to think, actually, I mean, there's always questions when you read back or listen back and you think, why did I not probe that any further? But that's specific to the individual interviews. I think I would have, if I could have, do interviews at the site where the factories used to be. I think that would have been interesting, because one of the things I tried to get was a sense of space, a sense of what was this factory like, because what really came out in the interviews, and others much more qualified to speak than me have wrote about this in terms of the female factory space as being a kind of contained society, if you like. It's a break from the home, it's a break from everything else. And I think it would have been good to just kind of get a sense of, you know, take them back to that space. And even though you can't go into the factory because they've been used for other things, even just being in that location, I think, could have elicited more kind of nuanced discussions about, you know, what that space meant to them as women and as workers.
Mm-hmm. And turning to the extract, which you've mentioned already, tell us something about that. Tell us about why you chose this one.
So in thinking about activism and people's relationships with activism now, Helen Monaghan was the shop steward. She led the dispute throughout the 7 months. She is, you know, an incredible person. She's speaks very well. Got a real sense of what she was doing and why she was doing it. And I went into the interview with Helen thinking that there would be some kind of grand narrative of activism. You know, I was in school and I was, you know, leading school strikes, and then I left school and I was involved in this and I was involved in that. And it was just the complete opposite. Helen left school, she had worked a few different jobs, she had never been on strike, she had never been part of any formal labour politics. She did not consider herself an activist at any point until she went into the Lee Jeans factory. And it was that idea of unfairness, injustice and mistreatment of, and she says it in the excerpt, of the younger ones. And this is something that I'm really interested in. It's the age dynamic between Helen and the rest, because probably the majority of workers in Lee Jeans were fresh out of school, 16, 17, 18-year-old, whereas Helen was 40, I think, at the time of the dispute. In fact, no, she's probably older than that. She's in her 40s, because she's 84 now. And it was much more of that kind of protecting the young ones from exploitation that actually led her to become involved in the union, to become involved in trade union politics. And I think that is interesting because, you know, in a lot of literature, especially the writings in the 70s and 80s by Glucksman and Cavendish and people like that, talk about the kind of mothering role of the older female workers who don't want to see the young lassies, as Helen refers to them, that's her words, not mine, don't want to see them mistreated by management. So it's that kind of, she fell into becoming a trade union official. She didn't go into the factory, you know, this kind of idea, especially in Clydeside, you know, this idea that you get these bullshit people that just want to cause problem for capital and want to be on strike and that kind of nonsense that we're used to reading about in popular representation. So she was somebody that went to work, noticed unfairness, noticed mistreatment of younger people, and took it upon herself to kind of say, look, this isn't on, this isn't how you treat people. You know, and that does chime with a lot of the kind of writing around multinational corporations in Scotland at the time, that they didn't understand that kind of Fordist approach wasn't necessarily going to work with the workforce that they were inheriting, because that wasn't how things had been done previously. So it's that real change between how managers manage and how bad management leads to activism, kind of accidentally, if you like. So, and that's it. It was, I remember doing the interview and really kind of being taken aback, and I think it obliterated about 5 questions that I had to ask her about her political upbringing, her political activism throughout her lifetime. And then it's bookended at the end of the dispute by saying, as I touched on earlier, the dispute was done, we had won, and that was me. I was finished. I stayed a union member, I wasn't a shop steward, I wasn't involved in anything. That part of my life was over. So it's about sporadic and specific activism, you know. And one of the things that grates me in kind of industrial relations literature is this idea, and it's something that I kind of thought about when I first started doing it, that the Lee Jeans occupation was spontaneous. It was a spontaneous response. Actually, when you interview people, there is no such thing as a spontaneous response by workers. These are actions that kind of develop at the workplace. It is those kind of bonds of the everyday solidarity, if you like, that kind of manifest themselves. And that came to a head when the factory was going to close. And by that point, Helen was a shop steward. She had had experience of being a trade unionist and took the action that she took. It wasn't just militancy for the sake of militancy. It came from somewhere that had roots in the workplace, and it had roots from 10 years previously when she first got involved in trade unionism.
It struck me as well that there was an awful lot of the informal there. So it wasn't about formal structures of the trade union movement. It was informal relationships within the factory that mattered in terms of pushing her forward.
No, exactly, and that's something that manifests itself in the occupation as well. And I've wrote on this, and I can give you the links if you want to add it to the reading and stuff. But the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers were, for lack of a better word, useless throughout the dispute. They refused to make it official. And then Helen's got a lot of really interesting memories of what happened when they did make it official. So it was, you know, publicly, we support the Lee Jeans workers. Privately, right, Helen, we're going to tell you how you're going to run this campaign. We're going to tell you how you're going to work it. And by this point, and again, this is interesting in terms of gender dynamics, because I don't think a male workforce would react the same. A male workforce who were kind of embedded in trade union culture. Because for Helen, essentially when the NUTGW said, well, we'll tell you how you should do this, she essentially said, fuck off, I've been doing it for 6 weeks, we're going well, the factory is occupied, and we know how we're going to work this, I don't actually need your support very much. So it was that informal kind of structure of, you know, we've got this, almost like we'll take care of this, we would like your strike pay, we would like your support, but don't tell us how to run the occupation.
It's an extraordinary thing if you think about it, in terms of, you know, workers taking over their own factory, but not based on a formal structure.
It is, and that, as I've argued and as I am arguing the stuff that I'm writing, that comes from the bonds of solidarity at the workplace. It wasn't just a sense of capital relocating, you're going to be out of a job. It was capital relocating, and we're going to take this space that you visit, that you have a real attachment to, and this group of people that you have a real connection with, and we're just going to demolish it. We're going to pull it away. Another thing that, you know, was important to think about the Lee Jeans dispute is it was really very much framed within public subsidy. So the factory had been set up with public grants, substantial amounts of public funding. So that tied into it as well. And, you know, I would invite anyone that's listening to this to go and listen to the full interview, which I can send a copy of, or it is archived at Strathclyde. You know, she doesn't talk about the factory, she talks about our factory. Our factory, you know, and most of the people interviewed talked about, you know, that was our place, it was our factory. And there's 2 layers to that. I think it's ours in the sense of, you know, we're the people that are in there every day. We've created this kind of, I think Jackie Clark refers to it as a space for working class feminine interaction. Well, that's what the factory floor becomes. But it's also our factory in the sense that this is taxpayer paid. It's ours in the sense of, you know, we've paid for this. So there's those kind of layers of ownership. I think that's really speaks to why they occupied it. And they talked about this in the press reports at the time. It was like, this stuff doesn't belong to the company. This stuff belongs to the taxpayers of Inverclyde in Scotland. So we're holding on to it and we're keeping it because it's ours.
Did you come across any sort of informal culture around sort of selling stuff in the factory or small social groups?
So not in Lee Jeans, but I didn't ask the question. So that's an important caveat to make, because I hadn't really thought of that until I started. So the other, in fact, you asked what would I do different. The other stupid thing that I done while doing my PhD is I did the field work sequentially. So I went, I'll do the Lee Jeans interviews, and then I'll do the Lovable interviews, and then I'll do the place interviews, which caused a ton of problems. So anyone who's doing case study based research, just get the adverts out now and try and interview anyone that you can at the same time. So at Lovable, there was the cleaner, Violet, in the factory toilet. So the factory toilet was referred to as being like the Barras Market. You wanted something, you'd go into the toilet and Violet would get it for you. And again, it's really gendered because the stuff they talk about is it's perfume, it's jewellery, it's toys for the wains, anything you want, go into the toilet. And there's also that interesting dynamic with management as well, because there's this kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. She wasn't supposed to do it, but the managers knew she'd done it and just kind of let her get on with it. And it also, if we think about how kind of working class economics worked, it was done on tick. You know, so if you've seen something, if it was a Wayne's birthday, you go into the toilet, buy a bit of jewellery, buy a toy or whatever, and say, right, I'll pay you when I get paid on payday. So quite a lot of people spoke about Violet's big blue book, and she would come round on payday and say, right, Sadie, you owe me whatever it is, and she would go and collect the money. So that was something that was definitely a big part of the Lovable factory, and it was something that spoke about with a real sense of, you'd say nostalgia, but probably beyond that, because it's something that isn't, it's something that's gone, it's something that's lost. It isn't just a sense of, oh, it was great and we wish it was back. It's something that just, you could not imagine walking into a workplace. Now, if you think about Newcastle University and the corridor we're on the second floor of the Armstrong building, if you're in the gents' toilet and there's somebody there selling you aftershave, it just doesn't happen. And it would be the same in factories and warehouses and they type of places. So that was something that was talked about really fondly. In terms of social groups, that was a big part of the working environment, and that really came from pre-existing relationships that were in the factory. So your sisters worked there, your aunties worked in there, you knew people for school, so you went in with friend groups already, and then they would kind of transport. So if you went in, so I'll take Maggie Wallace for example, her big sister, 2 years older, had been in Lee Jeans 2 years before she had, so she had a group of pals. So then Maggie goes in with her school pals and then says, oh, that's my sister, and then meets them as well. And certainly go to the pub when you get paid. There was I can't remember which interviewee it was, but she used to always talk about, she would go on a Friday and she get paid, she would go to Tesco's, get the messages, and then go to the pub and meet the lassies for a drink. And by the time they left, there was no messages left because they'd opened the ham, they'd opened the bread, and they were sitting in the pub making them sell pieces. So there was definitely things like that. There was, management wasn't, what's the word I'm looking for, draconian. It wasn't a sense of you can't speak to them. It wasn't like regulated toilet breaks or any of that kind of stuff that we see a lot in workplaces at the time. It was much more, the workers had much more control over their workspace and their work time, so they could actually talk to each other, engage with each other. It was piecework, which has a lot of critics in terms of, you know, a shite wage and you need to work hard in order to make money. But the positive side that the interviewees kind of spoke about in relation to that was, if you wanted to have a blether, it wasn't you weren't on a line and you having a blether disrupts the person beside you. It was a sense of, if you wanted to sit down and have a blether with somebody, you could do it, no bother, and you would just have to try and make it up later on. And I think that is where the mobilisation comes from in the disputes. It was the fact that these were social groups as much as they were, you know, the shared experience of the factory floor and the workplace. And the closure of the factory wasn't just losing a wage, it was losing what they had built up in that space, how they had made it their own.